I'd like to welcome everybody to this last of the series of the academic year for the Centre of the Study of Social and Global Justice. My name is Andy Higginbottom. I'm very happy to be invited to chair this meeting. I want to thank the Centre for all the support it's given me over the last year or two, and I think it's a great initiative, and I'm very glad to see people here. The topic tonight is going to be introduced by PhD candidate Oliver Dodd, who's also very involved. He's one of the co-directors of the Centre, and he's going to take a deep dive into history of Colombia. And as you will already know, because this is why you signed up, the title of his talk is The Origins of the FARC EP and the Civil War in Colombia. And he is going to take a historical approach. This will take, it's a sort of lecture length time, up to about 50 minutes. And I'm afraid we'll have to mute you while he's on, but then it's very much open to questions and contributions. So I'm very pleased to present Oliver. He's been a great strength actually of the Centre, and he's always been facilitating others presenting their ideas and their material. So it's quite nice for him to have the opportunity to present some of the work that he's been doing, his research over the last couple of years. So over to you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'll just get my screen sharing. Yep, thank you very much for that, Andy. That was very nice of you indeed. So today, as Andy suggested, I'll be talking about the origins of the FARC and the civil war in Colombia. The FARC is obviously known as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, a guerrilla organization that was formed more than 50 years ago in 1964 on May the 27th. Of 1964. Many will know here that FARC signed a peace agreement in 2016 as part of a process of reconciliation and rebuilding, ending the armed struggle. Various breakaway groups have formed since then. The rationale for today's talk, I'll start off with the rationale, and then I'll go into a theoretical discussion. I'll talk about existing theories, what some of the conventional theories tried to do in terms of focusing on the armed conflict. And then I'll look at the way Colombia was historically incorporated into dynamics of global capitalism and how this related to dynamics of domination and Colombia's pre-existing political order as it was incorporated into global capitalism. I'll then continue with the structure of the talk by analyzing the trajectory of class struggle from the 1920s to the emergence of the FARC in the 1964. So I'll be relating how these dynamics of class struggle pertain to the broader structuring conditions before finishing with a conclusion. First of all, why Colombia and why the FARC? What is the rationale for my interest in these two cases, these two topics? First of all, I would argue that Colombia is strategically important for various reasons. It's strategically important to imperialism historically. It serves as the gateway to Latin America, to South America. Being on the border of Panama offers strategic access to the Panama Canal, which is geostrategic for the United States in terms of trying to control the Pacific Ocean, but also the Atlantic Ocean. Borders 5 countries, various countries of which have been ripe in terms of resistance over many decades. Colombia has been important to the United States in terms of trying to increase its influence across Latin America. But because of this, partly because of this, Colombia has also witnessed a long history of resistance, a very brave and tireless resistance in Colombia that has really been admirable in the way that they've stood up both to a domestic dominant class elite, but also externally to other actors that have tried to shape Colombia's political economy. And we could perhaps see this in the case of the FARC. The FARC, obviously the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, we might say was the most powerful communist organization in Latin America in opposition until 2016. More than 28,000 WikiLeaks cables, intelligence cables, revealed an obsessive concern on the part of intelligence outfits, particularly in the United States, in trying to undermine the FARC, whereas other organizations across Central America and Latin America signed peace agreements in the 1980s. Instead, with the FARC, we saw a continuation and expansion of the struggle, the armed struggle, the political, military struggle. So in order to understand the development of the FARC, the question today is, what can we understand about the origins of the FARC to understand the trajectory of the civil war? And how does this pertain to Colombia's broader political economy? There's been various conventional explanations behind the causes of Colombia's armed conflict. One of the main theories focuses on state weakness, factors of state weakness, often called state weakness theory. This might look at the failure for the Colombian state to assert itself over the national landscape of Colombia's territorial borders. Such scholars might argue, for example, the failure of the military, its weakness in relation to other groups. So there's a focus on state weakness as a problem in terms of trying to explain the development of the war. There's also a focus on grievances, factors of inequality, inequalities between groups. The question of land has also been a very important focus in the literature in terms of trying to explain the origins of the FARC and the development of the civil war. And a third perspective, which is particularly important in policy-making circles, particularly with academics who are looking to cozy up to policy-making establishments, has been this notion of greed, that insurgents aren't really interested in the political interests that they talk about, justice and injustice. What they're really doing is manipulating politically, they're manipulating political rhetoric, but the reality of their objectives is to essentially profit from war and pursue their own economic interests. Now, the approach today is a much more historical focus. I'll be taking a more historically materialist approach to the origins of the Civil War. Instead of focusing on particular factors in a kind of reductionist sense, I'll be looking at how factors of state weaknesses and grievances have been historically constructed over time. If indeed Colombia's military had failed to establish a position of power over potentially threatening forces and contending forces, why was that the case? How did it pertain to Colombia's character and the broader political economy? If indeed grievances pertaining to land are important to explain the onset of conflict in Colombia, how do these grievances relate to dynamics of social class struggle and formation in the rest of the political economy? And how do inequalities pertaining to the way that Colombia developed from a period of colonialism, from Spanish colonialism, how did that play into the way that these grievances were created? And the same goes with greed theory. If indeed people do choose to join organizations because of economic agendas, how have these settings, how have these economic agendas been shaped historically because of the way Colombia has been incorporated and shaped as a state over time? So I'll be looking at historical materialism. I'll be using historical materialism really to question and interrogate the specificities of Colombia's state formation. Instead of understanding the state as simply the military or the police and their relative weakness against other organizations that are potentially threatening to the state, I'll be looking at how the state has been formed historically, looking not just at state institutions, but also the broader picture of society and business associations and how other interests has really shaped Colombia's state historically. And I'll be doing this by looking at the organization of production, a focus on social relations of production, looking at who owns and controls the means of production, who controls power and is able to distribute or take away power and from the vast majority of people. So there's a focus on class struggle, the dynamics of class struggle, how social relations of production, control over resources give rise to dynamics. For example, the structuring conditions of global capitalism. Under this kind of conventional understanding of global capitalism, we understand capitalism as constituted by free labor, the separation of peasants from a means of production. Workers have nothing but to sell other than their labor power, and accumulation takes place on the basis of the exploitation of this labor power. However, in Colombia, I'll be arguing today that we have to understand Colombia not in a way that we might analyze Britain or another country, how industrial development formed there, how capitalism developed there. We have to look at Colombia historically. We can see historic developments in terms of the merging of capitalist accumulation, but this didn't completely overcome pre-existing social relations of Colombia, of social relations of production in Colombia. These relations combined with dynamics of capitalist accumulation. So we need to look at the origins of Colombia's incorporation into global capitalism. We need to look at how it went from a colony to a formal political independence. In Colombia, we saw an elite engineered political independence in an effort, economic and elites, in an effort to join world markets and produce and benefit from economic opening on the basis of free trade. We saw Colombia's economic elites want to move away from Spanish colonialism because it closed down the opportunities for these economic elites. So there was an elite engineered political independence where power was shifted from Spanish colonialists to the local political elite, but the property relations, the broader property relations in terms of economic inequality, control over land, these fundamentally remained. Colombia, as it was incorporated into global capitalism, was also highly racialized and patriarchal. Indigenous people were highly subordinated to white economic elites linked to Spanish descendants and notables. So we have to look at how indigenous people were oppressed and how women were oppressed and subjugated by men, and how this played into Colombia's later political and economic dynamics. We need to focus on the question of land as Colombia transitioned from a colony to open up into world capitalist markets. It was constituted primarily by social relations involving what are called hacendados, landed elites, where campesinos, peasants, are highly dependent on these hacendados for subsistence, to reproduce. So they're not producing for world markets, they're essentially producing in order to survive while the haciendado allows them to do so. So as we saw the penetration of capitalist expansion and the reorientation into Colombian society, Colombia was incorporated into global capitalism highly unevenly and in a way that was combined. We saw, for example, these pre-existing capitalist relations, pre-capitalist relations combined with dynamics of global capitalism. We didn't see the emergence of an industrial proletariat and a capitalist on the one hand. Colombia remained highly agricultural, export orientated, and was dependent on external markets, including the structures of imperialism. At the time, the Industrial Revolution in Britain needed product, it needed money for capital for its to export its manufacturing products. So Colombia was very much seen as one of the opportunities in terms of access to markets. So it was British imperialism that had an important role behind the way in which Colombia was integrated into global capitalism. In other words, the rural political economy, in becoming export orientated on the basis of agriculture without entering into what we typically understand as capitalist social relations constituted by free labor, we saw a reorientation of the rural political economy, but we didn't see the transformation or replacement of the rural political economy. Just as under colonialism, Colombia continued to be characterized by the wealth and power of a small landed elite that was highly influential and dominant over the vast majority of people who were campesinos. Campesinos were highly dependent on landed elites for services, for access to resources, for access to land. And so Colombia integrated into global capitalism in a way that was highly clientelistic, where these landed elites were able to impose themselves over the overwhelming majority of people. And this shaped the processes of land accumulation and dispossession as Colombia was reorganized for production on world markets. Whereas in previous times under colonialism, Colombia was organized on the basis of haciendas and not production for world markets. This reorientation around production of world markets led to an expansion into other crops like tobacco and eventually settling on coffee. But this led to the breakdown of previously existing agrarian communities and social strife for many across Colombia. It led to many campesinos migrating in mass in order to try to benefit from and profit from this emergence into global capitalism, this production for world markets. So the processes of land accumulation were strongly shaped by a landing elite that had the wealth and the power in order to take advantage of access to world markets. Colombia is often called the oldest democracy in Latin America, if we go by the definition of a regularity of elections. It's true. But if we understand Colombia by focusing on the power relations exist, the inequalities, the social relations of domination and subordination, then we can ask, to what extent was Colombia really a democracy? Just because it had a regularity of elections doesn't mean we can consider a democracy where the people are included in decision making. And this had a role, clientelism, the way that landowners or landowning elite was dominant over the campesinos. This had a role in terms of incorporating the masses of campesinos into political machines, into the liberal and conservative parties, two dominant parties. It incorporated them in a way where they were highly dependent on these political and economic elites, and that had a role to play in the course of class struggle. So we went through a period. I'm moving into the second part of the presentation today, where I'm looking more at the trajectory of class struggle. As I said earlier, Colombia was becoming increasingly orientated around production for coffee. Coffee became the dominant export at the end of the 19th century. It significantly increased in terms of investment, financiers and investment, significantly invested in coffee exports. Masses of campesinos migrated in hopes of joining production for world markets, but in the course of doing so, they were often forced away by armed thugs funded by landowners, but also they were subject to rehabilitating contracts. They didn't own the land. They didn't own the wealth to purchase the land, because as coffee was increasing, so was the cost of land. And so it was very difficult for campesinos to benefit from this push towards export-orientated markets. And so during the 20s, this period was titled The Dance of the Millions, where we saw significant investment into coffee. Coffee exports doubled between 1915 and 1920 and continued to increase. The government at the time, the conservative government, banked on export-oriented agriculture. But then this reliance on one crop, this reliance on coffee, made Colombia very vulnerable to external dynamics, made it very vulnerable to a crisis of overproduction. So when the crisis struck, the Great Depression struck in 1929, this essentially caused a crisis of overproduction, where masses of peasants were left without the means to survive. Social and economic catastrophe spread. People who had invested in land, dominant elites that had invested in land, foreign capital, they weren't able to gain a return on their investment. And the export-orientated agricultural form was discredited, as many campesinos fled en masse to the cities in desperation to survive. And this discrediting of the export-orientated agriculture led more to a rethinking of the economic model. There was a push towards a more state-led industrialization model in terms of trying to embrace the production of industry for people within Colombia, domestic industry. And this was also supported because manufacturing products from abroad were becoming too expensive, too costly, given the collapse in agriculture. And so from this reorientation away from agriculture and towards industry, we saw the foundations for a class alliance to form, particularly within the Liberal Party organized around Jorge Gaitan, who was a left-leaning Liberal Party politician. Jorge Gaitan rallied really against the traditional political and elite. He rallied against the exclusionary character and nature of Colombia's political system and tried to harness the disenfranchisement and the anger and disillusionment that had been left because of the social and economic collapse. And he did that by trying to bring together nationally orientated industrialists, workers that felt, that they had an interest in building up an industry, but also disenfranchised peasants, campesinos, and also artisans who felt pushed out by the exports from Britain and increasingly the United States. So this led to a cross-class alliance under the leadership of Jorge Gaitan. But in the context of economic collapse, dominant class interests tried to reassert their influence over property. They were trying to reassert their power over land in order to prevent the kind of instability coming to them. We saw various contestations between the government acting on behalf of the economic elites and striking workers and campesinos. Most famously in 1928, we saw the United Fruit Company, the army butchered thousands of United Fruit Company workers. But there were other massacres taking place, especially by landed elites, as campesinos decided to organize and try to, in the context of collapse and social devastation, to try to organize to establish a role for them to survive, the basis for them to survive. And it wasn't, this trend of class struggle, this dynamic of radical popular mobilization continued up until 1948 with the assassination of Gaitan. On April the 9th, 1948, Gaitan was expected to win the 1950 presidential elections. Immediately, the key figurehead of the radical movements that had been forming had been killed, and there was an immediate reaction. Uprising spread across Bogota. Government buildings, strategic areas of the city were taken by workers, labor organizations. The US embassy was attacked, and workers took radio stations calling for people in the provinces to join in with this insurrection. And insurrection eventually moved away from Bogota to the provinces where revolutionary structures were formed, juntas, governments were taken over. And this really led to a pattern of repression. This in the context of Gaitan's assassination, the Liberal Party elites, they were concerned about the power that the Conservatives would have over them. Again, people were organized in a very clientelistic way, highly dependent on these political elites. And in the context of repression, the Conservatives went on the offensive, destroyed, decimated labor organizations, particularly in the cities. The Americans got involved in trying to make out that the immediate reaction was the work of international communism, when really what the uprising lacked in the aftermath of the killing of Gaitan was a kind of coordinated leadership to organize these various dispersed groups that have responded in such a way. So a period of repression set in, not only against labor organizations and campesine organizations, but also between Liberal Party structures and Conservative Party structures, became known as La Violencia. And in the midst of this spreading violence, particularly in rural areas, we started to see campesinos coming together to organize collectively some of the few areas that were actually free from spreading violence. We saw a strategy of self-defense start to form in 1948. 1949, the communists in their Central Committee meeting ordered for communists to continue to support these self-defense communities. Many communists at the time were organically connected to campesino communities because they were campesinos themselves. And this led to the emergence of strategy of self-defense, what I might call the social foundations for the later emergence of the FARC, which I'll come to a little bit later. Deepening political and economic stability and rural unrest. As I was saying, it wasn't just the landed elites going on the offensive against campesinos, it was also violence between liberal and conservative party political and economic elites. So there was really growing instability. And this seriously concerned the traditional political elite in Colombia. It started to worry them because they started to see these agrarian structures in the countryside and these groups in the countryside becoming increasingly independent from the two dominant hegemonic political parties. And so there was a growing incentive, especially as their economic investments were being disrupted by growing violence. There was a growing incentive in order to support a military coup, essentially. And that military coup came in 1953 under the leadership of Rojas Pinilla. I call it a military leadership rather than a military dictatorship. This is a debate. Because the civilian forces, the traditional political elite, they came together to back this military coup. Business associations propped up this military coup. And the whole purpose behind the military coup was really to moderate and reduce the tensions between Liberal Party and Conservative Party, while at the same time going after the more radical agrarian organizations that were becoming increasingly independent from the traditional political and economic elite. However, the period of military dictatorship was ultimately a failure. It lacked a flexibility. Its main purpose was reducing the violence between conservative and liberal party elites. And when it achieved that mission, it really lacked the flexibility to go after these more radical structures in a form of reform. It was very anti-communist. It attacked them. It sent people into the countryside to occupy various areas. But there was really concerns over a lack of reform being used and an ability to use reform. And then when Rojas Pinilla finally did try to pursue a process of reform, a more independent path from the traditional elite, that's when they essentially overthrew Rojas Pinilla. The business associations called a strike. They relied on their various clientelistic groups to overthrow Pinilla, and they established in 1957, it was implemented in 1958, and a coalition known as the Frente Nacional. The Frente Nacional was a national front agreement between the conservative and liberal party elites. It promised to share power between them, share equal distributions of mayors, civil servants and senators. In this way, it was trying to protect the privileges of the oligarchy. There's one intelligence document that was released at the time from the CIA, released by WikiLeaks, where the CIA essentially calls this an obvious attempt to protect the interests of the oligarchy. But there was also a broader effort of trying to stifle and pacify the kind of resistance that had emerged in the countryside. There had been an attempt at constructing various reforms. For example, in 1961, land reform was implemented in terms of trying to stifle and pacify agrarian resistance. There were acciones comunales, structures, local grassroots community structures inside countryside areas, which were really trying to get people involved in organizing, but in a way that they were dependent on the traditional elites. And so there was a process of reform. Communists were suppressed in the trade unions. Trade unions were incorporated into the structures of power alongside liberal and conservative parties. And this reform process was really aimed to try to undermine the appeal of more radical structures that were acting in resistance for calling for a more fundamentally transformative situation. But alongside the Frente Nacional, there was also what I call a carrot, a stick for the carrot. You know, there was not only the carrot of reform, there was the stick of counterinsurgency. The United States at the time, we're talking about the early 1960s, was particularly concerned about the role of the Cuban Revolution. It was particularly concerned about the various agrarian structures in Colombia that had a strong communist influence that had formed to defend their interests. And so there was a plan in 1962, essentially to destroy these structures, to go after them. Paramilitarism, famously in Colombia, was legalized in 1962 under what was called Plan Lazo. These were essentially private mercenaries funded by landed elites in order to protect their property, private property. So on the one hand, we saw reform, but we also saw a push of military and counterinsurgency offensive. And when you look at the archives in Colombia, in terms of archival documents, massacres were happening really throughout the 1960s of campesino organizers in Marquetalia, which I'll come to soon, a bastion of what became the FARC. One of their organizers were killed. But really across the country, repression was being used by the military because there was obviously a clear failure for these reforms to succeed in trying to pacify this unrest. So I'm getting into the period of the FARC, the origins of the FARC. And the FARC really was born in a region of Marquetalia in southern Tolima. This had been one of the self-defense organizations that had formed in 1953. The Colombian state had tried various occasions to destroy these independent, what they called independent republics, these self-defense zones, tried to undermine and attack them, use various violence. But in Marquetalia, they were particularly strong and organized. They had a very collective form of organization. They were distributed land to peasants. They had their own militias. They were very well organized. And this was one of the more symbolic attacks in terms of offensive and what led to the creation of the FARC. The attack occurred in May of 1964, but it was by no means a, often people talk about Marquetalia as if it wasn't if it was just, an area being occupied by the Colombian military. In reality, this was a national and international event. It led to trade union structures across Colombia really writing open letters, private letters to the president. It led to international solidarity movements being formed in defense of the Marquetalianos that were being subject to siege. And it was encapsulated probably best by a letter that I came across in the archives. And this has been excluded really from the collective memory of Colombia. It's an open letter that was signed by more than 300 campesino families just as Operation Marquetalia was about to be launched, just before. And it described in detail over a period of days, a period of pages, a number of pages. It described in detail, how the peasants in the area had been unable to basically survive because of the way that landowners have been treated and the violence that had been used. It describes in detail the forms of economic blockade that had been used by economic landed elites. And it's really a testament to the kind of perspective that these campesino families were experiencing, the situation that they were experiencing. Nevertheless, the operation went ahead. More than 16,000 soldiers were used, supported by the United States. Napalm was used, bacterial warfare was used. Marquetalia was really seen as a symbol of agrarian resistance. And they eventually occupied Marquetalia. The operation was started at the end of May. It took them a couple of weeks to finally occupy Marquetalia, force the peasants into retreat. But from a military point of view, it was an epic failure. It failed to defeat the key organizers of the peasants in the area, prevented to decimate the structures, and it allowed them to retreat to other areas where they formed relations with other agrarian organizations and groups that are experiencing very similar kinds of repression, very similar kinds of economic blockade. And so they retreated to these other areas where they formed relations with other campesino groups. And it wasn't until 1965 until they came together to organize a national conference in Cauca, actually. And they concluded that because of the repression, the way that Colombia's armed forces have been upgraded thanks to the support from the United States, that the strategy of self-defense was no longer really applicable. It had served its purpose, and that they needed to transition from self-defense to more mobile operations, to more mobile forms of guerrilla warfare. And it wasn't until in the 1960s they also announced their agrarian reform, a policy of agrarian reform, Programa Agrarian, which really called for a democratization of land, a reform that had been much more radical and fundamental than the kind of social reform that had been implemented in 1961. And in 1966, it was decided to essentially nationalize to make the struggle national. They gave themselves the title of the FARC in 1966, and the 2 years prior to that, they called themselves Bloque Sur, the Southern Bloc, because these had been groups, agrarian groups, that had formed mainly in the south of Colombia. So the decision was taken in 1966 to essentially expand into other areas, organize themselves on the basis of a professional guerrilla army. And this was really the period that led to the very foundations of the FARC. So in terms of the conclusion then, we can only really understand the origins of the FARC in 1964 by going back to the way, by analyzing the way in which Colombia was incorporated historically into dynamics of global capitalism, how the various social relations of production that existed prior to the development capitalist social relations, how they combined unevenly with global capitalist dynamics and led to particular forms of struggle in the 20th century, especially organized around struggles over land. In other words, we can't just look at the grievances that had been formed in the early 1960s to explain and understand the origins of the FARC. We need to look at the way these agrarian struggles and land inequality had related to dynamics taking place much earlier, especially periods of class struggle dating back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And a third point we can take away is far from a product of the willpower of adventurous guerrilla fighters in Latin America have notoriously been called as voluntaristic. In the sense that they create the revolution, but the circumstances aren't really right. In Colombia, the FARC really emerged out of a historic, organic, situated nature of class struggle in Colombia that was peculiar to that. In other words, so only by understanding the history of Colombia, the way it was incorporated into global capitalism, the trajectory of class struggle, can we finally understand the origins of the FARC in the 1960s. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just checking thank you very much. You were very punctual on time, by the way, well within your 50